Everybody tells me to be more thoughtful. Well, I'd like to be more thoughtful. If I only knew what it meant.
How do you go about being thoughtful? What do you do? Every time I try, I only make things worse. Is there some particular method of being thoughtful that works every time?
Hello and welcome to my model corner Project 41. Today we take on the ICM 148 scale Douglas A-26 Invader light bomber that served the United States in 3 wars from World War II to Vietnam. I receive requests now and then to build a particular subject or a particular kit. In this case, a viewer shared that his father flew combat, piloting the A-26 in the latter part of World War II. Craig stated that if I could construct any version of the Invader, he would be most appreciative. This box art from this ICM kit appealed to me, so I chose this one. However, the ultimate goal of this project changed shortly after its start, as I will relate during the video. So, without further ado, let's begin with the build, which is why you are here.
I'm going to give the people what they want. Sensation, horror, shock. Send them out in the streets to tell their friends how wonderful it is to be scared to death.
Starting out this time, we'll begin by cutting multiple parts from the sprue trees and set them up on pallets for a crowded painting session, and return to each of them individually as the assembly sequence progresses. This is my first time using this Atom Zinc Chromate Green since my out-of-production Model Master bottle had run out, but it didn't adhere very well to the silver enamel, so it would scratch and chip easily, and even low-tack masking tape would remove huge pieces of it from the model. I tried using some clear gloss coat to bolster its strength, but it only worked to a limited degree. I was forced to be less aggressive when doing detail washes on the green coat, while also doing touch-up airbrushing if too much paint came off. As I continued to correspond with Craig, and as he shared more images of his father, Lieutenant Russell Simpson, and the A-26 he actually flew, and that I was able to find other images of the Oklahoma Outlaw online, I realized I had enough reference material to convert this model into a replica of the Oklahoma Outlaw. I wanted to surprise Craig, so I never told him of my plan to reproduce his father's actual A-26 Invader aircraft in miniature until I released this video. The model I had on hand was a slight variant of Russell Simpson's A-26, and it would have been easier to have started out with this version, but ICM had all the parts within this kit necessary to retrofit it, as it were, to our required version. Additionally, only simple custom decals would be needed to duplicate the correct markings of the Outlaw. As I always say, it's your model and your world. Construct and detail the kit in any way that you prefer.
It's good to be the king.
As we construct the cockpit items, I'll introduce some facts about Lieutenant Simpson. Craig and I are putting together a more detailed biography of him as a separate upcoming video. The cockpit pieces aren't super detailed, but we'll work with what we have in this set. We were given 4 bombs for a 2,000-pound total bomb bay payload. There are another 2 bombs provided if you wanted to add those for the wings option. We'll set up each one of these and then get them painted. It was easier to record the airbrushing of the bombs by placing them on top of these paint bottles. This is just to show the work of the 4 bombs being made in the split-screen collage, with the upper left one completed as a guide for the others. The lower right one is out of focus, so I nicknamed it our blurry bomb. And we'll affix them to their respective racks ahead of time before adding them to the bomb bay proper. Now that we have those internal components done, we'll begin to add to our left side internal fuselage. This aft bulkhead of the gunner's station is the only part that didn't fit so well. Some glue and putty had to be applied to fill in the gaps. We continue to build up the inside structure with all these sections. Again, it's one of those models that have detailed features that won't be visible. It's not museum level moldings, but it's up to the modeler how far they want to take it from basic detail or up to exceptional detail. There are these two small glass pieces below the vertical tail that need to be added, and also have to be masked off on the outside for subsequent paintwork that could easily be forgotten. When it was time to mate the fuselage halves, the dry fit seemed to go well, but once the glue was applied and the pieces were pressed together, everything seemed to change and required many clamps as well as extra post-work on the seam lines to fix things. While we let that cure, we'll work on other things, starting with the dorsal turret station, and I imagine this is the machinery part that would drive the turret and handle the feeding and ejection of the 50 cal cartridges. I did some paint chipping, but I don't think anyone will ever see this again. This is the gunner station, which has its periscope with upper and lower lenses for the gunner to sight and direct his two remotely controlled turrets. If you carefully glue the upper gun top to the lower section, you'll have a movable turret. However, the lower turret has no provision for this aspect and it has to be glued into a single position, unless you can fashion a modification of some sort. This is another tail-heavy aircraft, and it requires a large 40-gram counterweight to establish a proper center of gravity. Luckily, we do have a relatively large space to add our weights and hot glue within the nose. However, this large ballast can be problematic for some airplane kits as the landing gear is at risk, which we'll talk about later when we arrive at that portion of this video. The ventral panel that holds the turret had a large gap at its forward end. There should be a panel line there, but not that wide. Stretched sprue was draped over the space, glued, and then sanded down. The upper turret panel fit very well, but unfortunately later on I had problems with the forward end that actually split from the fuselage and also created a step. I ended up reworking it a couple of times, and it will look messy throughout the build. It wasn't until the very end of the build that I got it near to where it should be for the final reveal. Unfortunately, this kit does not provide us adhesive pre-cut masks for the glass pieces, but only offers up this paper template in the instruction pages. You can try and cut your tape to these shapes, but I ended up just doing my old method of area under the curved pieces. I usually do the glass pieces last in my model builds, but we can do this early and use these also as an overspray defense and have the window frames painted at the same time. I only temporarily glued them on to be able to correct anything and still have access to the cockpit and gunner's station especially. Since we don't have those pre-cut masks, it looks a little more difficult, plus I'm trying to record this without getting in the way of the camera. Once everything was sealed up, a silver coat went on top of the central fuselage. Since the plane is so shiny, there is an anti-glare paint applied to the nose. I've seen where some A-26 aircraft have this pattern extend far down the nose toward the gun barrels, but for our particular tail number, it was only painted about halfway from the cockpit windows to the nose tip. The edge was a little off on the right side, but you'll see shortly that was corrected quickly. The decal set has a plane of rotation warning line, but we'll paint that in since it's a simple shape. Some Invaders had this line extend across the nose gear doors, which is what I started out doing, but I found that was incorrect for a specific plane, so I removed it in the midst of the task. And now we'll do some more detail wash on the fuselage, getting at those panel lines and rivets. As you may notice, some of the larger panels are discolored. I randomly airbrushed in some sections lightly using X19 smoke to give the aluminum skin a more natural tarnished finish in places. While we let that dry, we'll work on the nacelles and open bomb bay door pieces while we're at it. Since the chromate green wasn't sticking all that well, I was able to do 2 tasks at once using wash while doing paint chipping and wear. Turning our attention to the wings, we'll make another modification from the intended layout. We'll just drill out only 4 holes for the underwing gun mounts rather than the multiple holes required for the kit's rockets option. The only internal structure for the wings that we have to worry about are these little exhaust grates that need to be prepared and placed inside. A panel is added to each wing's leading edge, which is blank, that substitutes for the 3-gun barrel piece variation. Once both the wings are bonded, we can do additional work, which includes some zinc chromate green for the landing gear bay portion that is part of the wing. For the cylinder heat dissipation fins, the much darker Tamiya black panel liner is used to highlight those features nicely, as we've seen with the Devastator models. A clip of 8 pieces are shown, then we'll switch to a close-up of 4 of them. Once that's dried, construction of the engines is performed. There are 2 engines which I just named number 1 and number 2 since they're interchangeable to whichever side they end up mounted to on the wings. Wherever I can find information on the parts, I try to include them as a learning tool if you're not familiar with something, and it also reinforces my own knowledge. There are various opinions on what the crankcase color should be, but I usually go with this gray. As we complete each piece, we build up the engines. Everything went well together here except the engine mount rings. There were barely any contact points, so I used CA glue. One thing of importance in this assembly is the drive shafts because I want my propellers to spin freely as always. However, we're presented with thin and delicate tapered spindles. I much prefer solid full cylinder drive shafts for strength and stability. An unusual aspect of this kit is that there is a jig to correctly space the exhaust pipes. I haven't seen such an item for a model since a Yukikaze destroyer jig for one of the ship's masts. This engine jig was very useful, and it lines up the exhaust stubs perfectly, as you'll see when we mount the engines to the wing nacelles. Each of these engines required 9 exhaust stubs for a total of 18. On to the propeller work, which is self-explanatory. I'll take a pause from speaking and use this occasion to bring in the max afterburner rain. The engine nacelles are next, which also house the main landing gear. Both sides are pretty similar, but I decided to present each as separate sequences here to avoid another split screen at this time. As we continue this build, I'd like to give you a heads up on a couple of videos I hope to release in fairly rapid succession. These aviation-related stories required more research, deeper looks into archives, new software work, and site visits, which even put me in a near life and death situation.
The light that burns twice as bright burns half as long, and you have burned so very, very brightly, Roy.
As the engine cowl flaps go on, this regrettably hides our exhaust piping pieces. The only way to salvage these would be to do an engine maintenance or crash diorama of sorts. We also have the anti-glare on the inner sides of the cowling as seen from the pilot's perspective. The instructions aren't clear on how far this should extend, and I assumed half of the entire cowling shroud. Then, wartime images suggested that 1/4 or 3/8 were also possible. I then changed to 1/4, but then I saw that the Oklahoma Outlaw in one oblique image answered that it should be the 3/8 version, which I fixed near the very end of the whole project. Now that we got all this painting done in this area, we'll go ahead and remove the overspray protection from the engine faces. For the exhaust sooting, the airbrush was directed at the output ports of the exhaust pipes and making more concentrated lines from there and towards the aft end. The spaces in between were also smoked to a lesser extent, since a lot of the images of A-26s demonstrated that very dark and dirty nacelles were common. We also applied the sooting to the over-the-wing areas behind the engine cowling. You can fill it in as much as you want. You can make it light or very dark or in between, as it is your model.
It's got to be the king.
I go back and forth on my projects whether to paint the nav lenses before or after adding them to the wings. These were pretty small in this case, so I painted them afterwards. I came up with these custom decal fonts for our A-26, which I always start out first with a paper copy to test that the symbols are sized correctly when held up against the model. After I'm satisfied, they are printed out on a blank decal sheet and a couple layers of clear coat are applied to fix and strengthen the toner. The coating works well and doesn't make the clear portions of the carrier film edges more visible. I started with the kit decals first, getting those in place to get warmed up. They held up well, but they needed an excessive amount of water to get them off the backing. I think since the metallic silver paint is a smooth enamel, the decals were much more prone to set on the surfaces very well. Even the large blank areas of the black rectangles bonded and became virtually invisible. Our first custom decal will be Margie on the left engine cowling. There are supposed to be quotation marks on each side of her name, which I painted in later. Our most important custom decal besides the tail number is, of course, Oklahoma Outlaw. The easiest custom decals to make were the tail number for both sides. Next is our Josie custom decal. It was interesting that each of the women's names had their own font style, and this one has a more gothic look to it. We add Sally from an upside down perspective for ease of application, and I'll turn it over in a second so you can see it right side up. So the Oklahoma Outlaw had its side registration as 5 Charlie November. Next to the model I have an actual image provided by Craig with Sergeant Valentine Strepenski entering into the gunner station through the upper window. So it's a nice reference picture so that I can line up things nicely. At this point I was worried about the carrier film showing up from the custom sheet, so I cut 5 and Charlie into 2 pieces and cut as much of the clear decal portions away. But I learned that it bonded just as well as the kit supply decals, and therefore the right side 5 Charlie was done as a single piece step, which made alignment work much easier. So on the left side it reads 5 Charlie November, however on the right side it reads November 5 Charlie, as you read left to right on either side. Once all the decals were completed, detail wash was applied, steering clear initially of the emblems and then kind of gently rubbing the wash over the decals as I cleaned it up. You should have the streaks run in the direction of the airflow over the wings in this case, but you may see me go in some different directions at times to build up wash in crevices and facilitate cleanup, with the remaining strokes going in the airstream direction. Another important deviation from the intended kit configuration is to add these guns and mounts, which are included in our box but weren't meant to be used. And just another collage as we put all these gun mounts together. The various flight control surfaces need to be worked on and caught up with the rest of the model's progress. So we'll be repeating the same steps as we did with the central fuselage as well as the wings and the engine nacelles. This may seem like a little extra work having the tires separate from the hubs, but it's so much easier for painting purposes. Sometimes we have difficulty putting tire halves together as well as the hub fitting in the center, but there were no problems on this set. The metallic silver comes in handy since the hubs are already painted and only need the wash. The spaces between the spokes on the nose hub should not be solid but rather open. I did not want to drill and cut these parts, possibly causing damage or weakening the hub structure. I did notice in a lot of pictures that the A-26 nose hub spaces often just look black. I elected to paint it as such much later and even after I added the landing gear to the aircraft, which made it tougher to do. The main landing gear structure was a little unusual for what I'm used to. As we saw earlier, a lot of weight had to be added to the nose of this A-26 Invader. The nose gear is barely adequate to hold this aircraft up without collapse from a simple bump. The weight may even cause the supporting struts to warp over time. So once again, model manufacturers of these tail-heavy aircraft need to be informed that white metal gear or metal rod insert braces should always be included to support all the ballast. This would make everyone happy.
What do you mean, everyone?
Everyone!
And now the detail wash for the landing gear. For our final step, we'll add some weathering powder snow to create a look of wear and dirt, and then seal it in with some flat clear. Placing the wings went well, and at first it seemed like a perfect fit with no glue added, but there were gaps at the underside where they meet the central fuselage. The final portions of the overspray guards are removed. The final construction on the bottom commences, and while the doors went on with no hitches, the main landing gear was very tight and difficult to place in the bays, and I couldn't get it to flow very well for you to view, so it's a bit of a jump cut on both. A coat of the flat is applied to the bottom because I didn't want the aluminum metal surface to appear very pristine and new. Let's roll out 180 degrees. We're doing the 6-shooter version with 2 of the right side barrels a little longer than the others. You'll see the need for touch-ups at the bases of the barrels, which were accomplished with some hand brushing. As the flight control surfaces were added, I encountered a lot of snug fits and I was worried about damaging or even shearing the landing gear away, so I put the bomber on jacks in a sense, using paint bottles to take the strain off the gear from the different directional forces. As I put each of these pieces on, some fit better than others. We can remove our glass now, which will also allow us to install our gunner's periscope. I scratch built the antenna for near the cockpit and the one on the top of the vertical tail. And now we repeat with a flat coat on the top of the airplane as well as the cockpit and rear station to even out everything while we have the glass off. Even though the major glass pieces were masked off, there was some leaching onto the transparencies. Although we'll remove much of it, this was an unexpected opportunity to give the glass panes the look of some dirtiness and use.
Somebody ought to clean these windows. There is a tremendous buildup of gook all over them. Look at that.
Now that we have the gunner's glass in place, the upper turret can be rotated to the aft pointing position. Easy line is used once again for our antenna cables, or you can opt for stretched sprue. We're getting close to finishing this A-26 Invader light bomber. Stay tuned after the final reveal to see the preliminary thumbnails of our upcoming videos, which I hope you all watch. Take care, and we'll see you later.